So we spent the last couple of lectures talking about asexual reproduction and how prokaryotes and eukaryotes asexually reproduce. And so we're going to switch gears now and talk about sexual reproduction. So when we're talking about sexual reproduction, it's defined as combining complete sets of genetic information from two different individuals, typically, we'll talk about some exceptions to that, to make a new genetically unique individual. And that's really important, that the new individual that's created is genetically distinct from the parents that created that new individual, okay? And remember that sexual reproduction is something that is unique to eukaryotes. Only eukaryotes have evolved the ability to sexually reproduce. So let's look at a generalized diagram of how sexual reproduction occurs. And please remember that for sexual reproduction to work, it requires meiosis and it requires fertilization. You can't have sexual reproduction without meiosis and fertilization. Okay, so let's talk about the sort of generalized process of sexual reproduction where you've got two haploid gametes, okay? So when we talk about gametes, a typical example of a gamete might be an egg and a sperm, and they are haploid. So haploid is represented by this thing called 1N, where 1 represents the number of copies and N represents the number of different chromosomes, okay? So for example, in this haploid gamete right here, there are 2 different chromosomes. So we'll call this chromosome number 1 and chromosome number 2, and there's only one copy of each of those chromosomes. And it's the same deal with this haploid gamete. And so this is in contrast to this diploid zygote where you've got chromosome number 1 and chromosome number 2, or I can't remember which I said, maybe this is 1 and this is 2, but there's 2 copies of chromosome number 2 and there's 2 copies of chromosome number 1. And so this is a diploid cell. So haploid versus diploid. And so when haploid cells, like an egg and a sperm, come together, that process is called fertilization. So you've got a sperm cell, for example, fertilizing an egg cell to make a diploid zygote. So by bringing these 2 haploid cells together, we get 2 copies of each individual chromosome to make this diploid zygote. And now for this process to continue, this diploid zygote cell needs to go through meiosis to create haploid gametes again. So here we're looking at one part of that process of meiosis. So if you're looking at all of these cells here, one diploid zygote cell will produce 4 gamete cells as it goes through meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And I'm not going to cover this process in detail right now. All I want you to understand is that this process of meiosis cuts the ploidy in half, where you go from a diploid zygote that's 2N to creating 4 of these haploid gametes that are 1N. So your ploidy is cut in half. Now, the other thing that I want to drive home about sexual reproduction is that, yes, meiosis and fertilization have to occur for sexual reproduction to occur, but if you're a multicellular organism, mitosis is also occurred simply to produce this multicellular life stage. So this diploid zygote stage is going to go through mitosis to produce all the multiple cells that make up this multicellular life stage. Okay, so let's talk about ploidy in a little bit more detail because I think this is a difficult concept often for people to wrap their minds around. So eukaryotic cells, they have, remember, multiple linear chromosomes. So their DNA is organized into linear chromosomes, and there's multiple different chromosomes within a cell, okay? So this is in contrast to that singular circular chromosome that we see in prokaryotes. So for example, if you look in a human somatic cell, so a typical cell that makes up a human's body, within the nucleus there's all this sort of DNA, and that DNA, if you were to sort of break it out of the nucleus and stain it with these different types of stains, you'd see that the DNA is organized into chromosomes. And in fact, humans have 23 different chromosomes, and each of those chromosomes has its own unique essential genes. Okay, so for example, on chromosome 1, you might have a gene for eye color. On chromosome 10, you might have a gene for hair color. On chromosome 14, you might have genes for skin color. On chromosome 16, 8, and 4, you might have chromosomes for height, genes for height. And so each of these chromosomes has their own sort of combination, unique essential genes that are on those chromosomes, okay? And then for each chromosome, human cells have 2 unique copies of each of those chromosomes. Okay, so this is what makes those cells or somatic cells diploid. There are 2 copies of each chromosome. For example, on chromosome number 5, you'll have 2 copies of that chromosome. And on that chromosome, let's say you have a gene for hair color. So you might have different alleles or different versions of those genes on the individual chromosomes, where one has an allele for brown hair and the other has the same gene for hair color but has an allele for blonde hair. Okay, and so these are called diploid cells. And the reason they're called diploid is because there are 2 copies of each unique chromosome. So diploid is typically represented by this 2n, where n represents the total number of unique chromosomes. In this case, there are 23 unique chromosomes. And this number here represents the number of copies of each unique chromosome. So there's 2 copies of each unique chromosome for 46 total chromosomes, okay? Where n is the total number of unique chromosomes and 2 is the number of copies of each chromosome, okay? And it's diploid because it is 2. There are 2 copies of each unique chromosome, okay? And if we look at eukaryotic chromosomes, and specifically different sort of types of cells, you can have sex cells that are often called gametes, and those sex cells are typically haploid. So when we say haploid, what we mean is they have 1 copy of each unique chromosome. So for example, if you look at a sperm and an egg, they are haploid. They only have 1 copy of all of those 23 chromosomes. So if I were to blow up this sperm cell and look at all the chromosomes in it, it has 1 copy of each of the 23 unique chromosomes. So it's got a full complement of genes, but only 1 allele version of each of those genes. Whereas if we were to look at what's called somatic cells or body cells, so things like neurons, things like muscle cells, things like bone cells, all of those things are called somatic cells. These are cells that make up your body. It's basically anything that's not a sex cell. Those are typically diploid or 2n, and they have 2 unique copies. So example, if you were to look in a neuron and look at all of the chromosomes in there, there would be 2 copies of each individual unique chromosome, and therefore 2 different sort of alleles of each different gene that's on each of those chromosomes. Okay, so quick question. Let's look at this cell. Each of these sort of shapes in here represents a chromosome, a different chromosome. What would you say is the correct description of the ploidy of this cell? All right, so if you said this cell is haploid with an n equal to 6, that is correct. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 unique chromosomes in this cell, and there's only 1 copy of each of them. So this is a haploid cell with an n equal to 6. All right, let's look at this example. All right, if you said that this cell is triploid with an n equal to 4, that's correct. So if you organize these by the sort of shapes and colors of chromosomes, you'd see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 unique chromosomes, and then 1, 2, 3 unique copies of each of those different chromosomes. So this is a triploid cell with an n equal to 4. Okay, so given all that information and everything that we've talked about, which of the following is correct? All right, so if you said this final choice is the correct answer, if meiosis didn't occur before fertilization, so here we have meiosis occurring and going from a diploid cell to a haploid cell, and then these haploid cells coming together in fertilization. So if this meiosis stage didn't occur, these gametes would be 2n instead of 1n, so the ploidy wouldn't be cut in half, and therefore you'd have these cells combining and being 2n in the first place to get, after fertilization, you get a quadruploid cell or a tetraploid cell with 4 copies, okay? So if meiosis didn't occur before fertilization, when gametes combined, the ploidy of sexually reproducing organisms would double with each fertilization event. So that would happen again. So you go from tetraploid, and then you'd have another fertilization event, and you'd go to octoploid, and then you go to 16 copies. And so the point here is you've got to have meiosis to have sex. Otherwise, the chromosome number would double every time that gametes or cells combined, okay? Let's see why are the rest of these false. Meiosis 1 and 2 combined doubles ploidy. That's false. It cuts the ploidy in half. So if you go from meiosis 1 and 2 to this haploid cell, so you go from diploid to haploid, fertilization halves ploidy. That's false. Fertilization doubles ploidy because you go from 2 haploid cells to a single diploid cell. These gametes have the same ploidy as the zygote. Nope, the zygote is 2n. The gametes are 1n. And ploidy is the number of chromosomes divided by 2. No, it's not the number of chromosomes divided by 2. It's the number, the ploidy is just the number of copies of each individual chromosome.